All right, it is the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and kick things off. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining Network Partners for this Brunch and Learn web event, MDR Impact Outside of the EU, with Director of Regulatory Affairs, Susan Spelcher. A few quick housekeeping items. We ask that you mute yourselves upon entry. Note that a colleague will actively monitor and manually mute participants as needed. Please make sure you address all of your questions through the chat feature of this platform, and we'll address those questions at the end of the presentation itself. And then lastly, this webinar is recorded. You will receive both the recorded presentation as well as the PDF version of the PowerPoint itself. So without further ado, Network Partners' Director of Regulatory Affairs, Susan Spelcher.
Thank you, Renee. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me on this Thursday. Here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, it's a little gray and overcast, but we're looking forward to some spring weather this weekend. Like Renee said, my name is Susan Spelcher. I'm the Director of Regulatory Affairs at Network Partners. And today we're going to talk about the MDR impact outside of the EU. And I'll be joined today by Network Partners team member and my colleague, Crystal, who will be able to provide some information on the international registration aspects. I know we've all been very focused on the MDR transition for a couple of years now. And as I looked at my calendar this morning, I realized that the May dates that we were all shooting for a few years were next week. And next week would have been a big milestone. So I think this is very apropos to be talking about the MDR impact outside of the EU right now. A couple of quick notes. This presentation includes some personal reviews of me, the presenter, and Crystal, as well as Network Partners. And the information that's presented here may differ from actual regulatory requirements imposed by those health authorities. In part, we all know that regulations are constantly changing, and we try to keep information up to date, but just a quick note there. And then we'll be specifically speaking today about medical devices and the MDR, and we'll not be covering in vitro diagnostic devices or the IVDR. So with that, let's get started. So a real quick look on the global aspect of MDR here. We 28 countries in the EU prior to Brexit that we were really focusing on from an MDR perspective. And we know that 113 out of the 194 World Health Organization member states had some sort of legal framework for medical devices. So the idea that we've got to do something before we can bring our product on the market in those countries. The image on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see a lot of blue. All of those blue countries require 3 different elements before placing your medical device on the market. There are pre-market aspects of it, aspects of placing your device on the market, and then aspects from a post-market perspective. And you can see that's a lot of the countries in the world. We do know that some countries leverage CE marking for an abbreviated or an expedited pathway. So that's definitely one area that we want to look at when we're looking at how our CE mark is being impacted by the MDR transition. Additionally, we know that some countries require approval in the country of origin before they're able to approve a product for licensing in their country. So again, kind of some things to keep in mind as we're looking at international registration and how we're going about doing our planning in regards to our overall MDR transition perspective. So some questions that manufacturers and regulatory professionals have as we look at the MDR from a global impact perspective. And really what we've been dealing with and looking at from an MDR transition standpoint, what changes are required for devices per MDR? And at this point, those of us that have been in MDR transition projects and planning are starting to have a pretty good idea of what this is, particularly as we engage with our notified bodies and things going forward with that. Then from that, what of those changes impact countries outside of the EU? So where are those changes that we're making inside the EU impacting our devices outside of the EU and those registrations outside of the EU? And how can you prepare for that international impact now? So instead of just focusing specifically on the EU, how can we prepare for what that impact is going to be once we're really into the transition aspects? We know that registrations and the associated timelines can be expensive and lengthy depending on the device, depending on the country, and depending on the change. And we know that that has a direct impact to patients, to users, and ultimately to your business. So a fourth question that you might have coming down through these three is, how do you save time and how do you save money as you go forward with the transition and implementing MDR changes throughout the rest of the world? So first question, what changes are required for devices per the MDR? Over on the left-hand side of the screen, we've listed out quite a few changes that have possible product impact. And on the right-hand side of the screen, those areas that might impact the quality system. From a regulatory perspective, we know those tech files are moving over to Annex 2 tech docs. We know we've got to have Annex 1 GSPRs complete. And we know we've got DOC updates to add a lot more information that we had on previous declaration of conformities under MDD. Labeling. We know there are a lot of labeling impacts here. Your package, on your device. We've got new symbols. We've got new UDIs. Our IFUs in regards to the surgical techniques that we might be using might need to be updated to come into state of the art. Our patient information and what's going out to the patients on the implant card is changing. On top of all of that, our design might be changing. We might have claims that we have to modify or kind of spiff up a little bit. We have to look at our surgical reusable instrumentation and reprocessing. We've got new requirements around restricted substances and have to do a lot more work around there that might cause us to take a look at the R&D engineering side of our devices. Risk management, this is something that's constantly changing. We've got to stay up to date with the most recent ISO 14971 and how that is impacted by MDR. We've got usability aspects of our device that we need to look at, which is, dovetails right back into that risk management aspect, and software. We know that there's a new look at all the software aspects and potentially some up classifications that happen to our software as part of MDR transition. And then coming down to it, on the clinical side, CERs are hot and heavy. We've got a lot of work going on around CERs and our post-market clinical follow-up plans and kind of all of that rolling in. And kind of looking at all of this, you can see there's a lot of these changes that are interrelated. If I change labeling, I might be impacting my technical file, my GSPRs, or from a clinical perspective, if I'm cleaning up my CER, maybe I'm impacting my surgical technique on my labeling, and maybe there's additional risks that I have to consider. So as we look at all of these changes, we have to look at the changes holistically and not just individually. We can see that there's a potential waterfall effect as all of these changes are implemented. On that quality system side, we've got changes that impact this as well. Certs, registrations, new requirements and mandatory requirements around economic operators. On that quality side, we're prepping for audits. We have new standards and updated standards that we need to apply with. And we've got remediation activities for those legacy devices around those standards and around those upcoming common specifications that we see. From a post-market perspective, we've got new requirements around complaint handling and vigilance. And from a supply chain perspective, we have to look to see how this new UDI impacts our traceability in our current supply chain. So there's a lot that's going on that has the potential to impact international registrations. To get into those details a little bit more, we really want to hit on some of these heavy hitters. So when you're looking at your transition plans and you're looking at how you strategize, your heavy hitters are some areas that you probably want to spend some time really considering and understanding. And from a product impact perspective, I'm going to turn it over to Crystal and let her address some of that.
Thank you, Susan. So under MDR, especially for our high-risk devices, it's unlikely that we'll be able to use equivalency evidence or competitors' data to make our claims for labeling. There are much more strict guidelines around equivalency now. MDR also provides specific criteria for devices to be used as clinical evidence for equivalency. The MDR requires that a device a manufacturer claims equivalency for needs to share the same technical, biological, and clinical characteristics. So you'll need to provide your evidence for this equivalency in these areas. The new MDR will also make it so that our notified bodies will really need to scrutinize our claims and ensure that they're substantiated. We may end up needing to discontinue or remove product from the market and ensure that those products only go to countries not relying on the CE mark for registration. Or in the worst case, we may need to change our indications or promotional material. So our labeling could greatly be affected. Our package label, IFU, surgical technique guide, and our patient information leaflets. Here we could see a change in our symbols, the addition of the notified body number of Class 1 reusables, the indication of any medicinal substances, UDI information, reprocessing cycles, and our safety and clinical performance summaries.
Next up then on our heavy hitters, what are those aspects that are hitting our quality system that we really want to pay attention to? Again, we talked already about those certifications that are changing. We've talked about those tech doc certifications that will be updated. And we know that those class 2 implantables will need to be reviewed by the notified body. Our declaration of conformity, Article 19 and Annex 4 tell us exactly what we need to have on those declaration of conformities. We've got the SRNs, we've got UDIs that need to be added, and we need to consider how that impacts the registrations. And we know that there are changes associated with notified bodies, and in some cases, we're changing notified bodies, and how does that impact our SOPs, our quality management system aspects, and then down to the device. From a remediation aspect, when we begin to look at the quality system, are changes in our quality system driving design changes? Are they driving manufacturing process changes? And to what impact are our SOPs being updated? We know we have to look at management responsibility, how we're resourcing, how we're managing our resources from supplier selection and setting up the implementation and maintenance of a post-market surveillance system. So there's a lot of aspects that roll into the quality system that, again, have a chain reaction through both the quality system and then over onto the device side. Again, coming back and talking a little bit more in detail about some of these changes, we see that, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, that changes that happen on the clinical side could impact the design. Changes on the design side could impact labeling, and then ultimately clinical could impact labeling as well. So we really need to take a look at how we go through and assess these changes. And on the quality system impact, the certs, the remediation, and the supply chain aspects can be really heavy hitters for us. And all of this is going to push us to making tough business decisions around our devices that are registered outside of the EU. Are these changes that are happening falling under a re-registration? Is this a change notification? Is the change small enough that we can get away with a change notification? Or does this push us into a much more complex registration? We may have to make a hard decision as to whether or not we discontinue products based on the changes that are happening. But we can't lose sight of those countries that require little or no notification in regards to the changes that we're making. So as we look at this, what's the size of change that's happening? How does that impact existing registrations? And what decisions do we need to be making from a business perspective? I'm going to turn it back over to Crystal, where she's going to talk about those potential countries that are impacted.
Okay, so here's a list of countries in APAC, LATAM, and the EMEA regions where we're anticipating we might be needing to make some of these hard decisions for our registration or licensing. Keep in mind that the changes in these countries' licenses will also involve registration or re-registration fees, long approval wait times, waiting to hear back from the health authority, and in saying that you should anticipate requests for additional information from the health authority and possibly even sample requests, either for the product, especially if we're dealing with a design change, or for the labeling, because some countries prefer to receive sample labeling in a physical form as well. So there's definitely a lot to think about and a lot to try and plan for. So the countries listed here were chosen because they could be impacted because they have local registrations but can receive registration approval through an abbreviated pathway by leveraging the CE mark, or they have local registrations but the CE mark is expected, or they have local registrations which are harmonized with the MDD and therefore would be with the MDR, or they're relying on EU free sale certificates if the product is of EU origin and countries may need approval in the country of origin for registrations. So you may find approval in these markets difficult if you have any of those specific scenarios with CE marking and if you remove your CE mark. So to get around this, you may find that you need to either just use the country's normal standard route, which is likely to be lengthier and more costly, or go through a fast track route for another country like Canada or Japan. If this is allowable, of course, for the country that you're trying to get into. Lastly, keep in mind that the health ministries who leverage CE marking are aware of the current delay and difficulties with MDR, so they may have created a guidance specifically addressing it. TGA, for example, has put out an MDR implications for Australia guidance. Like Australia, countries may be preparing alternative pathways, amendments, or overseas regulatory agreements if there are delays in obtaining or maintaining your European conformity assessment evidence. So make sure your regulatory intelligence is staying up to date with global agencies the global agency initiatives related to MDR. Okay, so how can we start preparing for it now? How can I prepare for the international impact now? Well, you'll want to conduct a high-level overview of the regulatory impact to your devices in your markets. To do that, you'll first need to locate your devices. Where are they registered or licensed? Who's holding those registrations? You may be working with a registration holder or a distributor, like in countries like Brazil where it's required. Again, you'll also want to keep in mind and plan for the lengthy wait for the registration approval and try to stagger that into your timeline for registrations. Next, you'll obviously want to review your country regulations and see how they measure up to the MDR changes. You may need to re-register, provide a notification, or remove the product completely. Here, you'll definitely want to get in contact with your distributors, your in-country reps, and your international regulatory counterparts so that you have the most up-to-date information straight from the country's health ministry. Look for ways to bundle your submissions by grouping families, grouping changes, or fast-tracking through another country's approvals, like with Mexico's fast-tracking through Canada, the US, or Japan. Also recognize that classifications may have changed based on the EU classification, and this may be different from another country's classification. This will be especially important with devices that contain medicinal products or material of animal origin, as those require a lengthier, more in-depth assessment from the health ministry. The same with spinal implants based on their level of risk. Keep in mind that, at least for now, the MDD and the MDR certificates can coexist. Certificates issued under the MDD before April 2017 will remain valid until they expire, or up to 2 years following the date of application, which is 2022. Whereas those issued under the MDD after April 2017 will remain valid until they expire to the maximum of 5 years, or up to 4 years following the date of application, which is 2024. So really just try to schedule the transition in a manner that maximizes your effort, time, and money spent on obtaining those new registrations and approvals. So again, we really need to take the time and make a decision to rationalize. You really need to take this opportunity to look at your registrations and licenses and really clean house. You don't want to pay for license renewal fees for a license that contain product that you're not even selling anymore. That's money wasted. So if you're going to discontinue product, we have a formal process within the quality system framework. Some countries may require notification prior to the discontinuation. Some countries have notification requirements once a product has already been discontinued, and other countries can have products removed during their annual license renewal period. Now, if you're removing your CE mark from your product, you'll need to keep in mind that for some countries, they would consider the CE mark removal from the labeling to be a labeling change, and that would require notification. And some CE mark products are preferred and required by hospitals in certain countries for tenders, like in Latin America. So you do run the risk of losing those tenders. Lastly, as you already know, the CE mark is used for certain market license approvals like Australia, Switzerland, and Turkey, to name a few. So you do run the risk of missing out on those countries.
So as Crystal was talking about some of the different aspects of, discontinuation and things, one of the things that we really want to take a look at is managing the supply chain and really taking a look at the control systems that we already have in place. So from a country shipment controls perspective, we need to look and understand if multiple versions of the same product can be manufactured or shipped. Do we have the controls in place to be able to do that? How do we manage variants and different configurations of our device? One opportunity you might have to plan and prepare for some of these changes and transition is to do inventory builds. So it's the idea of doing a specific country stock of an MDD CE marked product and putting that into a warehouse or a distribution center before the date of transition so that you have product already there that you're able to sell through the transition period as we look at long timelines and things like that. We need to assess the impact on economic operators and map out that current supply chain to understand who would be considered an economic operator. And there are a lot of details in the MDR around economic operators. You want to partner with those sites or those external vendors that you've been working with and understand what's that partnership with them, who's responsible for what, and make sure that you have an understanding so that when it comes down to the question, there's already an answer and you're not trying to scramble for something at the last minute. All of this, as we've talked about, is interrelated and kind of has a little bit of a waterfall aspect to it. Any of this may have potential labeling implications that you need to consider as you go through that. So labeling is always something that we need to be taking into consideration as we're looking at changes both from a device side, an economic operator side, quality management system side. And really encouraging you to partner with your supply chain team to come up for solutions for your on-time compliance and preventing any supply chain disruptions. Again, we talked about how we know the transition's coming and we know that's going to impact our patients and our users in a business. And the less that we can disrupt that, the better we're going to be. So what does this all mean for us? We really want to be taking action early. Develop those country submission strategies early on and be able to work cross-functionally within your company. What is that license structure? Crystal talked about understanding where your licenses are. We need to understand, are all your products on one license? Are you part of an organization that has had quite a few acquisitions and there's multiple licenses across the board? What happens if not all of your product changes are complete at the same time? How are you implementing MDR changes and how does that impact those individual licenses that might have multiple products on them? Understand if you can submit registration changes while another change is under review. How are those rolling changes happening? And really build in some long approval cycles. We know that the notified bodies are getting, they've got more work than they can handle. And we know that there's long lead times on getting audits and reviews. That's going to happen for the health authorities throughout the world. And we need to be able to plan for that, going back and considering those inventory builds and what we might be able to do to prevent that. Being prepared for multiple submissions. There are still a lot of things associated with MDR that continue to change. And so if we go and make a change early, we might have to go back and make another change and re-register that device. So kind of understanding where those aspects might be and getting a little bit of foresight into, well, this change is happening, but we know these particular symbols haven't been finalized yet. So, kind of make a note that if they do get finalized and changed, where does that impact us? And begin to plan for that. Think about bundling those MDR changes with other product changes. Significant change coming up on your device in 12 months. Maybe you want to consider if you can bundle your MDR changes with that significant change that's coming. Changing a manufacturing location, same type of thing. Looking out to those changes. And so we don't go and do one registration and go, oh, geez, now we have to do another one 3 months later. Again, kind of looking at how we're working with those health authorities and being able to plan around that. Might be a discussion to have, particularly for some of those long lead registrations and those long timelines. How can we work with the health authorities to bundle that together to benefit both us and the health authority? And don't forget about submission fees. We know that there are submission fees that are anywhere from $1,000 to a registration change to $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, depending on where our products are, the type of registration change that we need to do. We need to be able to account for that and budget for all of that going forward. So thank you very much for joining us today. Take your questions now.
All right. First, thank you both to Crystal and Susan. Y'all did an excellent job, and we thank you and appreciate you for walking us through all of this. And the first question or comment we have is a comment, and it is under APAC, Singapore will be impacted as well. So just a comment there from one of our guests. And then the next is a question. Per the MDR, who are considered the economic operators?
So economic operators are manufacturers, authorized representatives, distributors, and importers. And I'd have to dive in to make sure that I didn't miss anything. But I would really encourage you, if you have questions about economic operators, to dive in and take a look at those specific sections in the MDR to understand how you define them within your quality management system. And so it's very clear who those economic operators are within your supply chain and what their responsibilities are. So you can do that through quality agreements, make sure that they're understanding what's going on, you're understanding what's going on. And then really, if you get things in writing and you work things into your quality management system, your notified bodies will look at that and see that you have an understanding of the MDR and you have an understanding of those economic operator requirements and what's mandatory for them.
Great, thank you. Next, if a device is a class 2A, single use and low risk, fairly low risk, can it still choose to rely on equivalence?
I guess maybe a clarification there might be around, is that specifically in regards to the CER from an equivalent standpoint? Might need a little bit more information on that.
Okay, if you typed in that question, if you could provide more clarification around it, I promise we'll get back to that question. Next is a comment. Distributors and importers are considered economic operators. And then another comment, for Australia, the TGA has not updated EP checklist to align with GSPR yet. Next question, you mentioned bundling MDR changes with other product changes. What other types of changes should I try to bundle with the MDR changes?
Crystal, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So this really depends on what your required MDR changes are, right? So if you're removing a product from a country that typically uses the CE mark for registration and licensing, you might take this opportunity to remove licenses for product that you no longer sell, like we mentioned in our presentation. And cleaning house this way could really potentially save you a lot of money in your renewal fees for licenses. Another example of bundling might be you have an upgraded version of a device that you want to put out on the market. So here you'd go ahead and make the changes and register that upgraded version that's MDR compliant. And again, it really just depends on the changes that you need to make and the country requirements and how you're going to notify that health authority for those changes.
Okay, so we have clarification on the earlier question, and it's specific to CERs. So let me reread the question for you. If a device is a class 2A, single use and low risk, fairly low risk, can it still choose to rely on equivalence? And this is specific to CERs.
Crystal, can you address that one? That might be something to throw back to our CER team. I myself am not an expert in CERs, and before I go and answer that question, I may want to reach out to Angela Stevenak, who's our director of clinical evaluation reports. So we'll go ahead and table that one for today, but we should be able to follow up on that one.
Yeah, definitely.
Excellent, thank you. Next is, can you give an example of the abbreviated route through another country's approval?
I'll take this. So again, I gave you the example in the PowerPoint Mexico. They allow fast tracking for US manufacturers through FDA clearance, Health Canada approval, and Japan approval. But the fast track for Canada and Japan are only for class 2 and class 3 products. So if you're an EU manufacturer and the country in question is requesting approval in the country of origin first, in order to move through the abbreviated pathway for registration approval, again, as we mentioned in the presentation, you might find yourself needing to go the standard registration route rather than fast track. This will cost more time and money, but in the end, it might be your only option to get your product to market. So it really just depends on the country's regulations.
Great. The next question is, does MDR differentiate between custom-made devices and patient-specific implants or patient-matched devices? And can any of these devices be CE marked rather self-certification?
There's a lot wrapped up in that one. So let's take that one kind of one piece at a time. So the MDR does specifically define custom-made devices early on in Article 2 within the definitions. So I would encourage you to take a look at that and kind of let's roll that question back a little bit, Renee. So it was around differentiating between custom-made devices and patient-specific implants.
and patient-specific implants or patient-matched devices. Here, I'll read just the first part first, one more time. Does MDR differentiate between custom-made devices and patient-specific implants or patient-matched devices?
Yeah, I would believe then that the custom-made device is specific in regards to how it's defined, and then those patient-specific implants would probably require a CE marking. We can dive into that a little bit more. You can reach out to network partners if there's a specific area that you might need some help with. Network partners has quite a few experts on staff on our regulatory team that are very familiar with implants that we'd be able to help you out with.
Great, thank you. And then here is another question. For Class 1 device, which is currently supplied under MDD, when does the manufacturer need to comply with MDR requirements by, for CER purposes? Sorry about that.
The date of application has been moved back 1 year, so you should be following the MedDev guidance on that. And then for an MDR specific, you would need to be in compliance by the date of application.
Great, thank you for that. And then we will be getting back to that question regarding CERs or specific to CERs, but I did want to quickly mention that Angela Siebenek is on the line, and she did quickly answer with, yes, you can rely on equivalence, but you must have clinical data for any equivalent device, just as an FYI. Next question. How does EU MDR impact a medical device packaging company aside from supporting the medical device manufacturers with FMD and product compliance related declarations?
How does it impact a medical device packaging company aside from supporting the medical device manufacturers with FMD and product compliance related declarations? I mean, I think that might be dependent on the packaging company's relationship with the medical device manufacturer and what has been agreed to between the two of them from a quality perspective. So I'm not sure that I can go in and specifically answer that question without really understanding kind of what's underneath that.
All right, so I'll give it another minute or probably more like 15 to 30 seconds to get in any last minute questions, and then we'll go ahead and conclude this presentation. Anything that we didn't get to, I promise we'll be doing some additional further outreach to make sure that we have addressed your questions. Oh, there is one more. So are there countries which require MDR compliance now?
None that I'm aware of. Being that the date of application was pushed back, we'll be looking for MDR compliance early next year. We're also looking for notified bodies to be ready themselves for MDR compliance, so not yet.
All right, well, great. Thank you to everyone for your participation today during this Brunch and Learn. Again, you'll receive this recorded presentation and PDF of the PowerPoint presentation. Stay in the loop and be sure to follow Network Partners on LinkedIn to access our updates and future webinars. Thank you again. Thank you to Susan and Crystal, and have a great rest of your Thursday.